Hello and welcome. I'm Christina Troutman from Business Intelligence Consulting Group. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar titled Oracle Business Intelligence for SAP Customers. Your presenters today will include John Andrzejek and Lisa LeFort. A little about John Andrzejek. He's been with BICG for 4 years. He has 6 years experience implementing OBIEE and 16 years total of application integration and development experience. His primary experience is with Oracle technologies. Lisa LeFort has been with BICG since we've opened our doors in 2004. She's got 17 years of experience in data warehousing and was previously a part of Oracle's data warehouse consulting practice. She's been involved with 20-plus implementations and has 8 years of experience specifically with OBIEE and Siebel Analytics. A little bit about the flow of today's event. Both John and Lisa will present, and then we'll have time at the conclusion of our presentation for a brief question and answer session. We encourage you to ask questions, and they can be submitted anytime through the question pane on your control panel. Also, please be sure to stay until the end of our webinar, as we will be giving away free training tokens to 2 lucky attendees. Without further ado, let's begin today's presentation. And with that, I hand it over to John.
Hi, thank you, Tina. Appreciate that. Thank you, everybody, and welcome. I appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to listen to some advice that we might have for you on using Oracle Business Intelligence with your SAP implementations. To get started, I'll tell you a little bit about our agenda. We're going to first start out and talk a little bit about OBIEE on SAP BW and just the basic mechanics of how that works. Then we're going to do a little bit of a architectural comparison, compare a standard implementation to one that's done on SAP BW. At that point, we're going to share a few observations. We got a hypothesis and a few conclusions based off of that. And then we're going to move on and talk about some important company-specific considerations that you might want to consider with your own companies before moving forward and making any decisions. Then we're going to talk about some very specific recommendations for OBIEE on SAP BW, some tips and tricks and some learnings that we've had based off of our own experience. And then we're going to follow up after that for those of you who might have interest in doing OBIEE implementation directly against an enterprise data warehouse. We're going to have Lisa LeFort's going to give you some advice and tell you a little bit about those options as well. After that, we'll have a Q&A session where we'll answer as many of your questions as we can based off of time, and then we'll conclude the seminar. Now, before we jump in and get started, we're going to do a quick poll, just this one quick question. Just select the one answer that makes the most sense for your implementation. I'm going to stop talking here for about 20 seconds and just give you time to go ahead and select it, and then we'll jump back in and move on. So Brian, go ahead and give them the poll. All right, we're going to continue on. Let's see here. Let's see. Can everybody here see my screen now? Let's see here. All right. All right. So to start, like I said, we're going to start talking a little bit about OBIEE on SAP BW to start. All right. The basic architecture of OBIEE and SAP BW is SAP BW is fed by SAP ERP. They also call it R3 or ECC or some other names for it. But the SAP BW Business Warehouse is sourced by the SAP ERP system. It contains, SAP BW contains objects. It's basically definitional in nature. It contains objects, some of which are called info cubes, info providers, multi-providers, and info queries. These additional objects are used when querying the database, and as you can see down on the right-hand side there, the star down there, it queries an extended star schema from a relational database. So the data actually does not reside in SAP BW. The data actually physically resides in a standard relational or a relational database. The schema that is used by SAP BW is a proprietary schema called an extended star schema that uses extension tables, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that and the implications of that later. All right. But it uses SQL to query that database. It retrieves whatever records that are needed. It does additional processing based off of the request and the definitions of each of those objects, like info cubes, info providers, etc. And then it converts that data to an XMLA format and delivers it to the BI tool. All right. SAP BW can also source a MOLAP cube. And so SAP BW is in essence what they call a whole app provider. It's a hybrid provider. It can source the MOLAP cubes and then the ROLAP star schema in the relational database. Once again, OBIEE sits on top of that and uses MDX is the language that's used to query SAP BW. It submits the MDX statement to SAP BW, and then of course SAP BW converts that into SQL to query the database or makes a decision to pull it from a cube. I also wanted to show you here that with SAP BW, the one standard tool that typically comes with SAP BW is something called BICG Explorer, and that tool uses a BICG connection. Okay, so most of the BI tools that are out there actually use an XMLA connection. This one uses a BICG connection, and it's when I would describe the BICG Explorer as being something similar to an ad hoc tool where you can pull in data and then pivot it in different ways. Okay, a lot of people will take it, they'll pull it into BICG Explorer, and then end up exporting it to Excel and doing further work with it. All right. The SAP architecture versus a typical architecture, it doesn't look like it's a lot different from the picture, but the main thing I want you to get out of this is there's an additional layer, and right in the putting any type of BI, and I'm not just saying OBIEE, I'm saying any type of BI tool on top of SAP BW or any ad hoc tool queries the SAP BW server, that converts the request, submits it to the extended star schema, retrieves the data and delivers it back to the tool for further processing. Whereas a typical implementation on an EDW, Enterprise Data Warehouse, the BI tool or the ad hoc tool would point directly to the database, retrieve it directly, and then manipulate the data. And again, the key point here to remember is that there is a extra layer of technology between the tool and the back-end database. Some key observations to gather from that is that SAP BW is really an application stack. It's not really a data warehouse. Data is not stored in the SAP BW servers. The data is stored, as I said, in a relational database. The SAP BW servers really contain primarily logic. It's object-oriented and it's definitional in nature. It's intended to, it's being used more like a data broker. You submit a request to the data broker SAP BW. It has a bunch of definitional objects that I would say they're almost akin to like views, various views, and then those views converted into SQL to retrieve the data, The data is then comes back to SAP BW and is further manipulated and sent to whatever BI or ad hoc tool there is. But the point is, it's really not a data warehouse, it's an application stack. The second point that's really important to know is that all data requests, when you're using SAP BW, all the data requests must go through the SAP BW server. In a typical implementation, you're able to take any tool and point it directly to the backend database and retrieve the data and send your request there. Here you actually must go through the SAP BW server for these requests. Third important point to know is that all data also must flow through the SAP BW server. So you don't send a request to SAP BW and then SAP sends the request on and then data is delivered directly to your tool. It actually, if you, even the most simple select must travel through the server. So if you, when you retrieve data, even if you're not doing any manipulation of the data is retrieved from the extended star schema in a typical flat format. If there's any other processing that needs to be done to it based off of definitions in the SAP BW server, it would do that, like calculated fields or whatever. But even if there isn't, it still has to travel that pipe, that extra pipe, and convert that into an XMLA format and then pass it back to the tool. All right, and there's of course network and overhead implications to doing that. You'll always have two pipes that it has to travel through, and then there's always sort of this conversion of the data from the flat format, retrieve format, into an XMLA format. So that overhead does have performance implications to it. Fourth, the SAP BW non-conforming extended star schema data model also has implications, and what I mean by that is that the SAP BW has a proprietary model that they're using which involves something called extension tables, and these tables are just additional tables that are created on the fly and allow the SAP BW developers to create objects on the fly. In order to do this, these additional tables are created sort of on the fly, and you'll have a lot of tables out there depending upon how your what the developer is creating. It does a couple of things for them. One is it allows the developer to add extra attributes or dimensions to fact tables without reloading the fact table. All right, so that's a benefit to a developer that's trying to create it. However, any of those additional tables also result in additional joins. And the more data you have that you're running through there, the more joins that you have, the more performance implications there are related to that. Additionally, their naming conventions are not standard naming conventions. If you were to go in and look at the SAP BW model, even if SAP BW would allow you to connect directly to the back end, you really can't do it because of the way the data model is set up. It makes it much more inaccessible for other tools to attach itself to it. You really have to go through SAP BW and submit your requests using their request format in order to retrieve data once you're using BW or once your data is in the BW business warehouse. What this also means is that the BI tool functionality is impacted by that. All right, every tool, not just OBIEE, must adapt to their specific SAP BW data request limitations as well as the delivery format. And what I mean by that is there's a number of things. I've only listed 3 for time purposes. But the first thing is that when you submit a request from any tool using MDX, if you submit a constraint saying in your tool and you say I don't want to see, the color red or the color blue, or that's all I do want to see, what happens is that SAP BW actually retrieves all colors, all the data, and then sorts that data on the SAP BW server. However, if you use what's called a SAP BW variable and pass it in a variable, then you can that constraint will get passed all the way back to the database and actually constrain at the database level. It's a key piece of understanding, you know, and limits the way you have to set up your repository or your request. It kind of forces you into using a query and then adding variables to it. You're not required to use a query. You can go directly at the info cube, which is considered the most basic level of data. It's almost akin to a fact or a fact plus its dimensions. However, if you're doing that, you do have that performance implication to it, is that you don't get the data, the constraint passed all the way back to the database. It only goes to SAP. So it's important to use variables. Hierarchy processing is different. There are performance issues with it, the way the SAP BW processes it. If you take that and extract that and put it directly into a relational database and query it, you'll get much better performance. So there's some issues you have to deal with there. And thirdly, time series functionality also is more difficult to work with. The most common reason for that is because SAP does not deliver a date field. It only delivers character fields that are formatted like dates. So what we've found is that there's a lot of workaround that has to be done with respect to taking something that's a date, intended to be a date, but it's actually character format, rearranging it so it looks so that we can actually then cast it as a date or a date time. Once you do that, then you can use your date time functionality, do date time math and things like that. But you have to do that for every date, and not all the dates are formatted the same way. There isn't a real standard format for it. So it's another hurdle that you kind of have to jump through. Moving on, the basic hypothesis is that what we've learned from studying not just OBIEE tool but also other BI tools is that the SAP BW middle layer really only poses additional challenges to the BI tool. So we're talking from the BI tool perspective. But it doesn't really offer any discernible benefits or functionality to that tool. Okay, there may be other reasons why you want SAP BW, and each company has to look at that. But strictly from a tool-by-tool basis, it only really limits or creates additional challenges, but doesn't really extend the actual functionality. So the conclusion, before we kind of jump into all the different ways of doing things, the first high-level conclusion that we have for you is that the BI tool implementation directly against a conforming enterprise data warehouse is really preferred. If you make that choice to go directly, it will eliminate a lot of challenges that you're going to have. And that's not just with, again, it's not just with OBIEE, it's with any tool. All right. And some of those I listed them below. You'll have a direct connection, you'd have a star schema, you'd have a naming convention that allows other tools to easily point and understand what's in the data. And then you'll have conformed dimensions that you can use across your enterprise data warehouse. So these are some reasons you might want to consider that. So the very beginning decision, before we again jump into all the specifics, is I think that every company, no matter where you're at, should at least consider that middle layer and maybe do their own cost-benefit analysis of the SAP BW middle layer. Does it make sense to point our tool to that middle layer, or does it make more sense to point it directly to a conformed enterprise data warehouse and have it, in effect, eliminate that extra technology? There's only going to be two answers to that. It's either yes or no. I'm going to handle the yes, and I'm going to talk to you about how you do it if you decide that you want that. And then Lisa's going to jump in at the end and tell you no, some things, other options that you may have. So to start, here are some things that we found that would be helpful for you if you're going to put OBIEE on SAP BW. First thing is that you're going to want to source your SAP BW using queries that have optional variables on them. Now, I've already alluded to this. Ideally, if you can go against info cubes, that's great, because info cubes are the most direct way to the fact table and the dimensions. However, for this one reason, this one performance issue where the constraints are being passed back, it's a good legitimate reason to use a query with an optional variable. So just remember, create a query and add these optional variables, and when you pass them, those constraints will get passed all the way back to the database, as opposed to pulling the data into SAP BW server every time and then sorting it there. Another performance enhancing lesson that we learned is that if you use smaller report-specific SAP BW queries as opposed to what I'll call a mega query, your performance is going to be a lot better. The reason why is because it goes back to the database design. Because there are these things called extension tables with these additional joins, and those extension tables that have the additional joins are the outcome of something called a navigational attribute that's being created, which is regularly used by developers. These mega queries have a lot of extra joins in them, and even if you're not grabbing those fields to pull, it still has an impact on the performance. So it's very important to understand that if you create a mega query and it has all these extra joins to these middle layer tables, it's going to affect the performance even if you're not using them. And that's one advantage that OBIEE has that I'll say right off the bat. I believe that business objects, or NetWeaver as they now call it, only allows for one source to attach to one subject area, the universe, they call it source, and that source, because there's only one source per subject area, they use more of the mega query concept, which has performance implications to it. OBIEE can take many sources and put them all into one model and one subject area. So that's one thing that is helpful on that side. Another thing to remember is that when you're filtering, is to filter on characteristic keys, not display attributes. Okay, so that's again something. The way SAP BW is designed, a characteristic, which is basically equal to a dimension, has attributes attached to it, just text attributes. If you query on they call them display attributes. If you query on the display attribute, that cannot be passed back to SAP BW or the database. All the data that anything you've constrained on is actually not constrained on in the initial request. It has to be pulled all the way back to your BI tool. So that, in this case, would be through two servers, and then the display attribute would then be filtered on your BI tool. If you filter on the characteristic, however, then that characteristic can be passed back, and that will either be filtered on this SAP server or the database, depending upon whether you have variables set up or not. So it's really important to understand the difference and to really shoot for filtering everything on characteristic keys. Another thing that's going to help you out a lot with OBIEE is if you create a consolidated OBIEE business model layer. And what I'm saying here is really goes back to my second point about creating SAP BW queries. If you're going to be creating a lot of smaller queries to help with the performance, you can combine those queries all into one subject area. You can take many different sources and merge them into one model. And ultimately what this is going to do is it's going to create a more flexible model for you to use, and it's also going to reduce subsequent maintenance, because your dimensions are going to be joined to each other, and if you change something in the sources, you have to go back and change the sources, but you're not going to have to change it necessarily in every single, you'll only have to change it in dimension once. Okay, so that, there's definitely a benefit to being able to merge. And again, that's another advantage of OBIEE, is the ability to merge all those sources into one model, business model, and one subject area. Another real important point to remember is to use or design with caching in mind. And this is a good rule anytime you're using OBIEE, or maybe for that matter, any tool, is that caching helps to eliminate extra processing, duplicate processing done on the database. But it's particularly important when you have a second layer, because anytime you design your report to properly use cache in OBIEE, that means you'll be avoiding two layers this time. You'll be avoiding the database layer and the SAP BW layer. So it's and you'll get your data back a lot faster. So it's definitely important to design your reports with caching in mind. Fifth, you should work with your SAP BW team to enable the SAP aggregate functionality. This is something that we didn't really realize when we first started, was that the cubes, when they're called SAP BW cubes that you're sourcing, when you're sourcing these cubes, it's really the equivalent of sourcing a dimensional model at the lowest level of detail table in the facts. So the facts essentially at the lowest level, and all requests are being submitted against the lowest level fact table unless you create aggregates. And the only way that's done is to enable the aggregate functionality and work with your developers to create appropriate aggregates through SAP BW. And ultimately what happens is they're configuring, creating more definitional objects that ultimately go back and create aggregate fact tables in the relational database. But if you don't know about it or realize that it's missing, you'll think, well, why am I not getting good performance? Well, it's because you got a lot of records and you're going up against the most detailed fact table every time. Lastly, the next point I think is really important is to upgrade to OBIEE 11G. If you're on 10G, there's some really neat features that are going to help you out a lot in 11G. And of course, if you haven't used OBIEE yet, you'd want to head straight for 11G. There are some very specific SAP BW enhancements that are going to be taking place and released sometime in the April-May timeframe. It's the 11.1.1.4 version that's coming out. There's support for ragged and skipped hierarchies. Right now, their ragged and skipped hierarchies are a little bit more difficult to deal with in 10G, but they can be dealt with. But in 11G, that functionality to make it easier to work with those is already built in. There's also going to be some changes, some improvements to the MDX, which are going to enhance the performance. So there's some adjustments that are being made to help the SAP BW server be able to process the information a little bit better. And those enhancements are coming out shortly in the .4 version. Another very useful piece of functionality is this double column functionality. And really what it does is it allows you to replace any column when you are doing a search. This is particularly useful with SAP BW simply because of the issue with filtering on a characteristic versus a display attribute. Let's give you an example. Let's say a characteristic is a company code, and you've got 100 companies out there with 100 company codes, and you only want one of them. I want company code 57. All right? Well, if I don't filter literally on that 57, if I actually try to filter on the display attribute, which might be Acme Computer Company, then all the data from all those 100 companies comes back. Well, that's actually a pretty relevant case because most business users actually want to use the display attributes to search on. They a lot of times don't want to use the characteristic key value. They want to see the description or whatever, and that's what they want to have in the prompts. So in this particular case in 11G, if you search on a prompt with a display attribute that's got the actual description, it will convert it to the company code in the background, and that's what it'll send, which improving your performance. Fifth, there's a new BAPI adapter that's coming out with this new version, and the reason that's important is, as I'd mentioned before, currently the only way for BI tools to connect to SAP BW is through an XMLA connection. The XMLA connection has performance issues with it. Okay, there's more overhead, let's put it that way. And by going directly and using the BAPI connection, that eliminates a lot of that overhead. So again, that's another enhancement that is very exciting for anybody who currently has it implemented, as well as those people who are thinking about implementing and are concerned about performance. And then lastly, of course, there's a lot of cool new BI enhancing functionality in 11G OBIEE, no matter what type of implementation you're doing. And one particular one that I happen to like is the action framework. And the action framework basically allows additional action to be taken based off of results, based off of other conditional results, or allows a user to interactively, when they receive a report and want to take action on an item, they can direct it right from that report. A good example might be someone has a receivable and it's over so many days and they automatically want to send an email to somebody or notify somebody. You can set it up so that it will send an email, take some action, send off a report, to somebody specific. It's highly programmable. There's a lot of built-in functionality, but it also has the ability to be programmed very specifically to very specific needs. So it's another reason that you might want to consider OBIEE 11G. Having said that, I'm going to pass it off now to Lisa. So for those of you who have an interest in, who might do this evaluation and have an interest in, instead of using the SAP BW middle layer, pointing directly to an enterprise data warehouse, maybe you even have data currently in SAP BW or data currently in the enterprise in your ECC system and want to port that into a enterprise data warehouse. Lisa's going to tell you about all those options right now. Go ahead, Lisa.
A little bit of a delay in advancing the slide.
Sorry about that. There's Are we still waiting on that? It's not coming back for you there, Lisa?
Yep, it's not.
All right. How about if I just advance it? You tell me when to advance it. How's that work?
Okay. Looks like that's all we'll have to do.
All right. All right, there you go.
All right, no presentation is complete without a technical glitch. All right, so if you've decided that you're not going to deploy SAP BW, what are your other options? One other option is to extract your data from the SAP ERP system and load it into a data warehouse and then use a business intelligence tool such as OBIEE directly on top of the data warehouse. One advantage of choosing this option is that you can integrate your SAP data with data from a variety of other sources. Even if you were to begin the data warehouse project with only SAP data, then you are at least laying the foundation for an integrated data solution across your enterprise in the future. Next slide. All right, so don't all EDW projects fail? The answer is no, of course not. It is true that data warehouse projects do have a higher rate of failure than other types of IT projects, but if you pay attention to these critical factors, then you do have a high chance of success. The most important things to focus on for a successful data warehouse project are executive sponsorship. You need someone in a leadership position who fully and vocally supports the project because you need the change to be driven from the top. Once you've established that commitment to creating a single source of truth, that can mean the destruction of personal data empires that have been built within the company. And you need someone in a position of sufficient authority to drive that change forward. You also need to make sure that you're going to receive adequate resources and prioritization for the project. And you need someone who's going to be capable of driving adoption of the project once the data warehouse has been implemented. You're also going to need a project champion who is usually not the same person as the executive sponsor. You need someone in the business with charisma and a vision for the project who can convince their colleagues of the benefit of the project for them and of the strategic value for them of the project. You also need really clear strategic requirements for the project, and that means you need to be delivering actionable intelligence that's aligned with the business needs. Your project champion is going to have a tough time selling the business on the benefits of the project unless it actually does have strategic value that they can directly recognize. Something else often not given enough attention is organizational politics. Data warehouse projects are often intensely very political because they cross organizational boundaries. They can provoke turf battles. The data analysis that's an inherent part of the project can expose problems in the underlying data that people have been willfully ignoring or sometimes even covering up. And they tend to expose flawed assumptions. And if you are someone who's been staking your leadership of the business on one of those flawed assumptions, that can be a very threatening experience. And as with any other IT project, you also need to have a competent project team, strong project management, proper scope control, and change management. Next slide. So even if you have a fabulous project team and an amazing executive sponsor and project champion and great scope control and excellent business processes, time is still your enemy. Big bang data warehouse projects are the ones that do fail at a very high rate because these are multi-year projects and 2 or 3 years is just too long to wait for a return on the investment. If you think about, for example, the rate of turnover within any company and especially in IT, if the project takes 2 or 3 years, chances are high you're going to lose a key member. It could be your executive sponsor or your project champion, a key member of the implementation team, a key subject matter expert on the business. And the other problem is that the requirements get stale. The business continues to evolve and grow, and their needs change during the 2 or 3 years it's taking you to implement this project. So even if you deliver on time, on budget, exactly to the requirements that you collected 2 years ago, you've delivered what the business needed 2 years ago, not what they need today. And of course, time is money. 2 or 3 years is very expensive. Next. So one of the ways that you can mitigate the time risk associated with a data warehouse project is to implement a package solution. Package solutions do some of the development work for you, so they give you a jump on that timeline and help you deliver faster. But I want to start off with some caveats about package solutions because sometimes I think the benefits can be oversold. There's no such thing as a data warehouse in a box. So anytime you hear that phrase from a vendor, it should raise a red flag in your minds. A lot of times the impression is created that you can just install this software and flip a switch to turn the ETL on and you have an instant data warehouse. And it's really never that simple. Every business is unique and every project is unique, so there's always going to be, even with a package solution, a period of gap analysis, and there's going to be some customization that's required because no packaged application is ever a perfect fit for an organization. However, that level of difference is usually down at the detail. If you take a step back and you look at what the projects share in common at a macro level, there is a huge area of commonality, especially when you talk about projects in specific functional areas like finance. So what the packaged application can do for you is prevent you from spending time reinventing the wheel by addressing those big areas of commonality. Next slide. So Oracle's packaged solution offering are what's known as the Oracle BI application suite. There's a variety of modules in the customer relationship management and enterprise resource planning area that target all of these specific areas: sales, marketing, finance, price analytics, loyalty, and these applications all work with a variety of sources, including SAP. Next slide. So let's go back to the EDW diagram and address why did these projects take so long? Where are the main areas of time consumption? So the big time sinks are the source system analysis and the source to target mapping between your source and your data warehouse, the time it takes to develop the ETL code to move that data from the source to the target and accomplish whatever transformations are required, the data modeling to actually design what the target data warehouse is going to look like. And then in your business tool, there's always some kind of development effort. And for OBIEE, that would be the repository development and the dashboard development. For anyone who isn't that familiar with OBIEE, the repository is the what's sometimes referred to as the metadata layer. What it holds is information about what does the physical database look like, what are the business rules and logical model, what are the cosmetics for how do we want these data attributes to be presented to the client, and what are the definitions and formulas for derived measures. Next slide. So what the OBIEE analytic applications do for you is a lot of the work in those areas that we just described. So what you're going to get out of the box is a pre-designed data warehouse. So you literally get DDL scripts to run to create the target objects. You get predefined ETL components to move the data from the source to the targets. You get an already built repository or metadata layer for OBIEE, and you get dashboards and reports to visualize information from the data warehouse. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, this is not, even with the OBIEE applications, an install it, turn it on, you're good to go scenario. You are going to have to do some customization. But the point of this slide is that the area of customization that will require the largest amount of effort is most likely in the front end. So, and the front end is where the least amount of effort is required to actually do that customization. Usually, customers don't spend a lot of time actually customizing the source system. So for example, chances are you have not substantially changed what the actual SAP ERP tables look like. You might have done a little bit of extension and adding, for example, additional columns or fields, but not a radical change, which means that it's likely the level of customization that you're going to have to do in the back end of the BI applications is very small. So the value you're getting in the back end, where most of the work is very great, because chances are you're going to be able to use the majority of the content that's created out of the box there. In the front end, chances are you're going to be doing more customization, because this is where the detail matters. Everybody's needs are different. Everybody's aesthetic desires are different. So although you can expect to do a substantial amount of customization in the delivered dashboards and reports, that's actually the least amount of effort, the easiest area to deliver change to. So even though it sounds like, wow, I'm going to have to do some customization, that's not quite what I signed up for. The level of effort associated with that customization is very small. So the value that you're getting out of the pre-built components on the back end is still significant. Next slide. So what's new for SAP specifically? The latest version of the BI applications, 797, includes an adapter that's built specifically for SAP for the financial accounting module. So the analytic application that we're specifically talking about here is financial analytics. So the advantage here is that the ETL code has been built specifically to source data from the SAP tables in financial accounting. I mentioned previously that you can use any of the applications with SAP, and that's still true. The difference is for the applications other than financial analytics, right now you have to use what's called a universal adapter. There's basically 2 stages to the process of ETL associated with the OBIEE applications. The first one is called the source-dependent extract. So that has ETL mappings designed for the specific source you're extracting from and loading into a staging table. All data from any source loads into the same staging table. And then from that staging table forward, we have what's called a source-independent load, because that load is the same regardless of what source the data ultimately originated in. So for other than financial analytics, right now you would need to use what's called the universal adapter. So the source end of that adapter is a generic source. So you would need to spend some time doing analysis to map that generic source to your actual SAP tables. So what's different specifically about 797 is now that little increment of work is taken away. The actual source end of the source-dependent extract is already mapped to the specific SAP tables for you. So you get 500 metrics and more than 250 reports that are specifically designed for financials. And that's usually the point that is emphasized by sales and marketing for any of the BI applications. But I also want to point out that you're not buying reports in a box. What you're really buying, where the value really lies, is in all the back-end development that's already done for you. So at that point, I think I will pass it back to Tina for some more information about BICG.
Okay, thanks so much, Lisa. Let me tell you a little bit about BICG. We can give away our free training, and then we'll go to our Q&A session. So about BICG, we're the largest consulting partner dedicated exclusively to Oracle BI. Our average consultant has over 3+ years of OBIEE experience with 10 or more years of BI and data warehousing experience. We have more than 280 successful Oracle BI projects under our belt, and we are 100% committed to project quality and customer satisfaction. A couple announcements quickly before we move on to the Q&A. We have a brand new website. It's at www.biconsultinggroup.com. If you'd like to get a list of our upcoming webinars and a longer schedule of our upcoming events, you can go there and check it out. Also, our brand new site is Web 2.0 enabled, and you can subscribe for RSS feeds there as well, so you can stay up to date on the things that we're doing. Our next webinar is on OBIEE 11G tips and tricks, and that's Tuesday, March 29th. Again, feel free to go to our website to register for that upcoming webinar. And we do have a workshop happening this Thursday. If you're in the Columbus, Ohio area, we're doing that free workshop around OBIEE 11G and BI applications. So now I think that we can move on to giving away some free training. So thank you for joining us. We know your time is very valuable. And as a token of our appreciation, 2 free BICG University training tokens will go to Jerry Loringer from Louisiana Pacific Corporation and Inderjeet Jill from American Express Corporation. Congratulations to both of you, and we'll be sending an email shortly after the webinar today letting you know how you can retrieve that free training token. I think that wraps up my piece, and we can now move on to the Q&A session. So I'm going to hand it back over to John.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks, Tina. All right, we've just got a couple of questions that came in. If anybody has any additional questions, please go ahead and type them in now. Otherwise, then I'll answer these couple of questions that we have. One question was, between SAP BW and OBIEE subject areas, do you need any connectors like we have with SAP BO? The answer to that is no. The way OBI works, if you actually physically look at the repository interface, you'll have a physical layer section, and you bring all these physical layers in. You import those physical layers. And then the middle layer is where you join everything in the business model. And in that middle layer, what you do is it's literally drag and drop. I mean, I don't want to make it sound that easy, but I mean when it comes to actually combining common dimensions and things like that, you're taking common fields and dragging them over each other, and then you'll have one logical field that will source multiple back-end sources. And so there are no connectors that are needed in order to do that. It just happens automatically that OBI will make a decision as to which, once they have been overlaid in the business model, OBI will make the decision as to which one to use, which one is the best one to pick from when it actually runs a query. And typically that has to do with where the facts are being pulled from. So if you have one source that has a certain facts defined and it's brought into that same model, it'll pull and use the dimension attached to those facts rather than some other table. But the end user, once you have the consolidated model, doesn't need to know that. They just grab the dimension, and then the facts are directly related. That dimension will be directly related to whatever facts they pick. There was another question here. Let's see here. Okay, so I think the original person who wrote that gave me a follow-up question. So you mean to say that there's no need for any transport connectors? I'm not sure if I completely understand what your question is, transport connectors. Not once it's in the BI model layer. Once you've sourced everything into the physical layer, you can have multiple sources there, and you can from those sources, you can combine them all in the business model. You don't need any additional connectors to do that, unless I'm misunderstanding your question, but I believe that's what you're asking. And if you want to further follow up on that, I would encourage you to email me at my email, and we can talk about that in more detail. Okay, how would you suggest going about getting support for moving from a current SAPW company to an OBIEE environment? We are Hyperion shop on the EPM side of things, but have had terrible results with their SAPW implementation. Well, there are a couple of options there. I mean, certainly it makes sense to sit down and have a conversation to talk about the specifics of your company and the data. But there are two different ways that you can go about porting the data, and Lisa has already alluded to some of that. One is that you can go back to the ECC system or your SAP ERP system, which is the source for your BW, and using either a universal connector or using the newly defined mappings for financial analytics, port that data directly from ECC into an enterprise data warehouse. So that's one way of doing it. Another way to do it might actually be to pull directly from SAP BW. So if you have objects that you have there, but just don't like the way the other object, the functionality of the other tools that are interfacing with SAP BW, you could just pull the data right out of SAP BW using those objects into a standard data warehouse. But the ultimate goal is to get everything into a data warehouse that's conformed that your tools can all just point directly to. So I apologize for the delay. I'm trying to read some questions here. Where does interactive reporting fit into the future of OBIEE? We currently rely heavily on 11.1 version 1113. Well, interactive reporting, I guess I'd have to understand a little bit more about what you mean about that. However, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is this action framework. The action framework is key. I mean, currently with OBIEE reporting, you've got a number of options. You've got standard reports that are created by a developer, and they're used primarily for display only. However, you can drill. You might be able to drill into different charts and graphs, apply prompts and things like that. We've always had answers, which is ad hoc reporting. So if you have your tool set up correctly and your model correct, users should be able to, at some point, be able to directly source the fields and build their own reports to some degree, which, by the way, I want to make one other point here, is it's harder to create a self-service environment if you're pointing to SAP BW because of the difficulties that you run into. Because of the workarounds you have when you're pointing to SAP BW, it makes it more difficult for a non-technical user to then use the answers or any ad hoc tool. So again, one of the real nice things about having a tool that points directly to an conforming enterprise data warehouse is that it allows users then to have more of that functionality themselves where they can actually create reports themselves. And then finally is the action framework. Action framework is a real important new feature of 11G that it looks like you've got 11.1.3, that you should explore that aspect, because that would be very useful and help with workflow type of issues. I think we're running up against a time constraint right here. I'll take a look at the rest of the questions and try to answer them offline. But just to be respectful of everybody's time, I'm going to pass it back over to Tina.
Thanks, John. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today for the webinar. We will be sending an email follow-up shortly today or tomorrow with a link to the PowerPoint PDF of the presentation, as well as a link to the recording. And again, if you do have any remaining questions, please don't hesitate to email any of the contacts that you see on the screen here. Thanks again, and we look forward to working with you. Have a great day.